Mhm. So this is group five, with group members being myself, Jayana Humphrey, Caitlin Long, Kwan Pulliam, and Aaliyah Miller. So this is podcast for designing quality classroom assessments. And the three objectives for this chapter were select the appropriate methods to assess specific learning targets, follow the steps in the assessment planning process, and create an assessment blueprint. Use an assessment blueprint with students as assessment for learning. And a brief overview is in this chapter, we explored the question of how should we assess? We read that assessments begin with a clear sense of purpose, have clear and appropriate learning targets, and rely on a proper assessment method. We also learned about the four categories of assessment methods and how we might use them.
Perfect. So I had objective one, which is select the appropriate method or methods to assess specific learning targets. And I thought the chapter was really helpful in doing this. So the four assessment options were selected response, written response, performance assessment, and personal communication. And it talked about different examples of each of those. So for selected response, those are things that are more traditional, like tests that we think of when, or I thought of when I first heard assessment. So multiple choice, true, false, matching, fill in the blank, those type of responses. Written response is like short answer, or it could be extended response, like a longer test answer. And then performance assessments are based on observations of a student performing or creating a product that a teacher is assessing. And then personal communication is like student or teachers asking questions, perhaps doing interviews or an oral exam or speech, things like that. And so the chapter went into more details as to each of these responses with those examples, and had some specific things. So for the selected response, it talked about how it's a series of questions that has correct or best answers, and it has proportionate questions for each of the targets you're supposed to assess. And then for the written response, it's responding to a prompt, a question, or a task. So it could be things that need more of an explanation. A brief response could be like a couple of sentences, whereas the open ended, longer responses should be several sentences, so it really can assess learning on that like more broad scale. Um, for the performance assessment, it talked about asking students to complete a task and using a rubric to help score that so that it was fair, and that it could be like biased a little bit if you didn't use the rubric. And then for personal communication, it was talking about using well crafted questions to elicit immediate response from students, and that a lot of times that could be used in formative assessments. One thing it did note was the portfolio assessments. They were saying like that is like a collection of assessments, but the portfolio isn't an assessment in itself, which I thought was interesting. Um, and so in that, it started talking about how do you select an appropriate assessment for the method. And so I really liked the chart that it gave with the four types of assessments and then the targets for the learning targets. So knowledge, reasoning, performance skills, and products versus the selected response, written response, performance assessment, and personal communication. And it went through how each of those ranked as far as an appropriate tool for assessment. I thought it was interesting. I'm not going to go through all of them, but I thought it was interesting that knowledge and reasoning had the most variety as forms of assessment, and then performance skills and products had the least, with product being the only one really was a good form of assessment for that. So that is kind of how you select those. It talked about how the first thing you want to do is make sure it's accurate And then the second consideration is the efficiency. So you want it to be 100% accurate, which is why um, you don't want to just pick the easier one, because that's when I was talking about the history of like traditional testing, and then we kind of moved to a more performance based assessment. Um, but because we are teachers and we have limited time, um, that we do want efficiency to be a consideration. So I thought that was important as well.
Okay, so objective two is follow the steps in the assessment planning process and create an assessment blueprint. So step one is planning a clear purpose. This establishes context. Step two is the intended learning targets and making them clear. This creates the focus. Step three is selecting the appropriate assessment methods. We select the assessment type or types that we will use to measure student based on previous guidelines. Step four is determining the appropriate sample size. So we essentially sample achievement in this because all assessments only include subsets of questions. So the blueprint is a record of your decisions made in steps two, three, and four. So it's very important to have a solid blueprint because it can become the foundation of assessment for learning. So that ends objective number two.
I had objective three, which is use an assessment blueprint with students as assessment for learning. And I feel like this objective piggybacked a lot off of objective one and two, and it really expanded on what had already been discussed in the previous chapter while reading the book. So the blueprint is created for any assessment that can become the foundation of assessment for learning and student involved activities. So in this chapter, we learned with the information from the blueprint, we can group students together for instruction based off their learning targets, share the blueprint with students at the beginning of instruction to build a clear vision of the learning they will be learning, of the learning they'll be doing. Ask the student to determine where on the blueprint their daily lessons fit, or have students write a practice questions on their blueprint to help them make sure that they understand and review the content. I felt that this was a great resource because it makes things such as learning and reflection more transparent for students. It allows them to get more involved from the other side and not just feel like they're getting thrown with tests and assessments all the time. Them being involved gives them that power and also allows them to track their progress. As a teacher, I feel like it allows me to make sure that I'm making the right decision when it comes to matching the learning targets and methods.
Yeah, I think that was good because I think for teachers too, especially like new teachers, like having that blueprint and the evidence is helpful for me to know what I'm doing and remember like learning targets and things like that. But it is also helpful for the students, like as another tool to help them make sure that they kind of fully understand what they're supposed to be learning, and they can kind of self assess if they're meeting that or not.
That's good.
And then I think, are we good to move into the reflection part? Or does anyone else have anything?
I'm okay.
Okay, so I had reflection question number one, which was which ideas did you find most convincing or useful and why? And again, I really liked this chart. I think it was like it broke it down really well for me, who, like I said, is new to this. I liked how it let me like pre assess what I thought it was. And then it gave a good explanation if that was like something that like it may or may not be. So, like, for example, um, let me find the one I was thinking about. For the knowledge targets and the performance assessment, it was a partial match. And it said like you may have predicted that it would have been stronger, but it can be problematic in different contexts. And I liked how it said that in different ones to get you thinking about like um, is this truly like the best method of assessment? So I think sometimes, like, at least for me, I get comfortable in like the same types of things, and I like a good routine, and I think a routine's good for students as well. But it may not be the best form of assessment for what I'm trying to get from them. Um, so I liked that it pointed those things out for me and would convince me to use different methods. I also thought it was interesting that the knowledge targets were sorry, not knowledge ones, the reasoning targets. To me, that's kind of a more like abstract thing to measure, but it seemed to have the most like applicable assessment tools, which I just found like super interesting that like when we were talking about reasoning and problem solving skills for students and like inferring things, and those things can be hard to like teach, but they had the most variety, and I thought that was just like kind of unique. So I think that it convinced me to take stock of like of my assessments, to really truly like drill down to what is best, and like Ali and Gianna were saying, like with the blueprint, like actually write it down so that I have the evidence for myself and can kind of assess myself in that way. So I think those things were really helpful for me this week. Um, and like making sure that all of my learning targets had context and the appropriate tool.
That's good too.
Okay, so reflection question number 2 was how does this chapter align with your own beliefs about teaching and learning? So, as a teacher, I currently enjoy the various assessment methods that I use, such as um, student journals or interviews. So, I think that these are good ways for students to learn to communicate better with each other and apply learning, their learning in a physical sense. So, all teachers should be able to use the assessment types that work best for their content, in my belief. So, most students like having teachers that can evaluate their learning in different ways. So that's reflection question 2.
Do you think
Cool.
for yours, like since you're doing CTE, like you use performance more, or what do you feel like you use more, like the most?
Yeah, I think definitely for performance. That's like the main one for
Yeah.
CTE. Yeah.
I would agree. I would definitely agree. I have reflection question 3. Which strategy or idea from this chapter would you feel most confident implementing and why? One strategy from the chapter 4 that I feel most confident implementing is the idea of intentionally matching the assessment method to the type of learning target, whether if it's knowledge, reasoning, performance skill, or product. The visual in figure 4.5 really made this clear by showing how different assessment types align better with certain targets. And then what stood out to me is that not all assessments are created equal. For example, selected responses work well for knowledge targets, but it's only a partial or poor match for performance skills and products. As a middle school, of course, family and consumer science teacher, I see this daily. And if I want students to demonstrate sewing skills, cooking techniques, or budgeting decision making. A multiple choice test won't give me, I feel, a valid evidence, although we are now pushed to test, if that makes sense. I need a performance assessment or a personal communication. Like, I really want to understand that you understand what the real life applications are and how they can be applied, not only within the classroom, but also outside of the classroom as well. I feel confident implementing this strategy because I already use a mix of performance-based labs, projects, and written reflections. My content areas are nutrition, interior design, and apparel. interior and apparel design, excuse me, and financial literacy, although the curriculum has changed. Financial literacy used to be not tourism, but hospitality and personal finance, which naturally lend themselves to product and performance assessments. This approach aligns with real world application, which is critical in CTE and also family consumer science classrooms. This chapter reinforced that good assessment design is about clarity of purpose first, not convenience. When I start with what exactly am I trying to measure, I can then choose the method that gives the most accurate evidence of student learning, and that intentionality is something I feel confident practicing consistently.
Okay, and I had the last reflection. What part of this chapter makes you feel uncertain, nervous, or hesitant about applying in practice? And I said selecting the wrong response assessment. By this, I mean choosing assessment option that I feel at the time was an appropriate choice, but after realizing it wasn't the good choice and a better choice could have been made. I selected this because, well, I feel uncertain about this because sometimes in the moment you feel this method will work best, but maybe once you start or get halfway through, maybe you realize, I feel like another method could have been used or this could have been better. And so for me, that makes me uncertain because I have to figure out, well, do I pivot or do I continue with knowing it isn't the best method?
I think
Do you?
that's the oh sorry.
No,
I
you
think
go
that's
ahead.
the most essential part of our jobs within day to day. I feel like with teaching it is about like trial and error to see what works and see what does not work. And I think when the moment we know that something does not work, it allows room for improvement to either maximize it within the moment or like you said, like pivot into like something else. But I think that is very essential for us within like our day to day, given most of us are handed like a curriculum, but there are no like rule books on how to actually teach the curriculum. You just want to hope and pray that the kids take away something and hold on to something with inside of your classroom of whatever your content area is that you're teaching.
Yeah,
I agree.
I think so, and I think too. Like, I don't know how many periods of each. I know a couple of you teach three different subjects, really, but like I teach the same thing. Sometimes some semesters I'll have 8 periods, and so it's like, do I change what I'm doing between periods, or do I like the next day follow up with a different form of assessment to make sure that those people who I didn't see, we couldn't evaluate the students' learning because maybe like for some of those it said like this would work, but if they don't perform well, is it because they don't know how to, or is it because of the like assessment tool itself? And so finding ways to like reassess maybe the students who, even if it wasn't the best method, but you got what you needed from some of the students, like finding a different method for the others, I think is like one way to like combat that maybe.
I'll speak to that a little bit. For us, we do semesters. So like this semester, like we have a whole complete new group of kids than we did last semester. But then on the days where we have like stuff like tomorrow, small group days, like you said, some stuff may work for one class and then some things may not work for another class, whether they're in the same grade level or not. And I think that's kind of like where we were discussing with our like CTE team today about that, like just seeing what it is that they really like are grasping and understanding, although like where we're at right now feels extremely rushed because of the snow, and then we're trying to get to know them and build relationships with them, same as them, vice versa. So it's just yeah, it can be a little tough.
I think so. And I think that's also like what you said about building relationships. Like when you have those relationships, then I think while we have this guide, and I think this was actually a really helpful guide for like what assessment tools were appropriate, I feel
Mhm.
like having the relationships with the students also is like a way you can determine what's appropriate, like you said, and like and distinguish between those classes. We have a student support specialist at our school who like helps if students are failing or whatever SEL issues, whatever they need. Because we have a pretty small staff. We have like 24, 25 staff members total. And so she's really essential in that. But she taught elementary school, and I work at a high school now. So she's at high school, but she's an elementary school teacher. And she's like, well, if people are failing, she's like, have you asked them a question? Can they prove that they know this information where you could give them partial credit even if they didn't complete this assignment or whatever? So I think that has really changed the way I see things for assessment sometimes is like, okay, well, maybe maybe they didn't do this homework or this test or whatever. But she's like, do you know that they know it? And if the answer is yes, then like trying to find a way to give them some credit to get them to passing if it's like on the line and it's, if they're going to graduate or not. So I thought that was an interesting way she's thought about it. She's like, yeah, I would just pull them up to my little horseshoe table and we'd sit down and have a conversation. I'd say, okay, 80% and call it a day. But she's also been teaching like 37 years. So she's seen a lot of different things. But I
Yes,
thought that
yeah.
was like a good
Yeah.
thing as a beginning teacher. Is like, okay, I don't have to have every single person doing every single thing exactly. That's like where some differentiation comes in. And I think that was kind of freeing to know that. Gianna, what for preschool, what forms of assessment do you use most? Or do you have a bigger variety?
For us, it's really mostly like observation assessments because a lot of them can't write yet
Mm-hmm.
and they can't like answer a test or can't read. And then so it's like a lot of assessment and then performative too. So like we're having to ask them and they're having to respond or they're having to show us or prove to us that they're able to do these things or that they know the knowledge.
Yeah. And do they, I don't know, a lot of things, but
Mm,
do you give grades for preschool or is it more like milestones or like if they're ready to advance?
milestones.
Yeah.
No grades, it's more milestone. That's what I said. Assessment is kind of hard with them, but then easy at the same time. Because I feel like with 4 and 5 year olds, you're very limited to what you can use and how you can assess them. And it's very by the book with that age group.
Yeah. Yeah, I would say like probably performance and personal communication would be your two. And then
Hmm.
for y'all, like the same thing. And I feel like for me, honestly, it's pretty similar since I'm not in like I don't really need them to know information per se. I mean, I do, but I need them to know skills. Like, where do you find your transcript? How do you send your transcript? Those things. All those. I redid some assessments for my class today, and I was like, I don't know if y'all use Canvas or Google Classroom or anything like that, but we use
This
Canvas,
yeah, this
and
for us.
okay, I usually use the graded survey feature because I can ask my questions and they can respond in short answer and then it can give them the credit because a lot of times it's not like a right or wrong answer. It's like what they've learned or reflecting or where they're at. But I've been going over some things with like because they need motivation on how to apply for scholarships because it's scholarship season. I'm like, y'all need this. You're gonna have to pay this bill here in a minute. So how do we pay for college? Like I've talked about the loans and the types of loans and them stuff. So I actually changed to a graded quiz format so I could answer like the select all, that apply or what is a direct cost for a school. And so I have never used that feature in Canvas. I always use graded survey because it's usually more reflective and I'm trying to see where they're at. But I had like some actual like content answers I needed them to know. So I changed it up last night for one of my assessments. So
We good to close out. Anybody else have any additional comments or anything before we close out? So I'm gonna close this out. So to close out chapter 4, one of the biggest takeaways is that quality classroom assessment is not about giving more tests, it's about giving the right assessment for the right purpose. This chapter challenges us to move beyond convenience and think strategically. Assessment should align with learning targets, provide accurate evidence, and ultimately support student growth. When we match methods intentionally, whether that's selected response, written response, performance assessment, or personal communication, we create more meaningful learning experiences for the student. As educators, especially in middle school settings, we are not just measuring learning, we are shaping it, and equipping them to be prepared for high school and beyond. Clear purpose, strong alignment, and thoughtful design allow assessment to become a tool of empowerment rather than just an evaluation. Chapter 4 reminds us that the assessment does well. Chapter 4 reminds us that assessment done well is not accidental, it is designed. And when it is designed intentionally, students don't just perform, they do understand.